The Panasonic Z95B and the LG G5 are two of the top WOLEDs of 2025, both built on LG Display's new primary RGB tandem panel. It stacks emitters to raise brightness and color luminance versus past WOLED generations. They remain WOLEDs, so you still get per pixel blacks with no blooming and wide viewing angles, but color purity is closer to QD OLED than before. That shared hardware is where the similarities end. LG leans into gaming bandwidth and bright room performance. Panasonic leans into creator-style HDR tracking, wide HDR support, and stronger integrated audio. Hi, I'm Evan from RTINGS.com, and I'll take you through what makes each model tick. Both TVs use LG Display's new primary RGB tandem WOLED panel, but not in every size, and that matters for brightness and color. On the LG G5, the 55, 65, 77, and 83-inch models all use the new tandem panel. The 97-inch G5 does not. It sticks with a conventional WOLED stack, so it won't reach the same HDR, SDR peaks, or color luminance as the smaller sizes. There's also a UK-only 48-inch G5 variant that doesn't use the new panel either. So, when we talk about the G5's performance gains, we're talking about the 55 to 83-inch models. On the Panasonic Z95B, the story is simpler. All three sizes, 55, 65, and 77-inch, use the same primary RGB tandem panel as on the G5. Panasonic's PQ tuning sits on top of that hardware, but the underlying panel capability is consistent across sizes. Alright, with that out of the way, let's talk about brightness. If you want the most impactful HDR in all sizes that use the new panel, the G5 has the edge, but you won't notice it in practice. The Z95B is still a very bright OLED and it looks fantastic with real HDR content, so overall, it's basically a tie here, even when gaming. Both are accurate in HDR2, but they present HDR a bit differently. The Z95B's PQ EOTF tracking is fantastic and tends to stick extremely closely to the creator's intent, which keeps midtones natural and preserves highlight detail without aggressive roll-offs. Just make sure to leave the TV's HDR brightness to its 70 out of 100 default, as anything more than that artificially brightens midtones, severely impacting the TV's accuracy. The G5's tracking is also excellent. Midtones can be a touch bright, and the TV applies a small roll-off near peak to protect detail on very high-nit content. If you like a slightly more reference-leaning baseline without tinkering, Panasonic's tone mapping philosophy will speak to you, but the G5 is almost as good. If you like to watch SDR content, especially in the daylight, LG's bright room tuning stands out. The G5 is very bright in SDR, and its glossy anti-reflective finish lowers the intensity of direct reflections. It also keeps blacks deep even when in ambient light, so daytime sports and news look punchy without washing out. The Z95B is also a very strong daytime TV, with very good SDR brightness and solid reflection control, but direct reflections remain a bit more visible in darker scenes than on the G5. If your space has big windows or overhead lights that you can't tame, the LG is the safer bet, especially due to its brightness advantage in SDR content. For colors, both TVs benefit from the primary RGB tandem design. Color luminance is higher than on older WOLEDs, so saturated reds and greens retain their pop at higher brightness levels. Panasonic's implementation is very accurate out of the box, while LG's is extremely vivid, yet still very well controlled. They're still WOLEDs, so absolute color purity at the very top end trails QD OLED, but the gap is much smaller than it used to be. When focusing on accuracy, Panasonic targets a purist baseline. The Z95B is very accurate in SDR, and its HDR brightness accuracy is fantastic out of the box, so you get believable tones without chasing settings. The G5 is even more accurate in SDR, but they're so close that the G5's edge here could be down to panel variance. Its HDR accuracy is definitely less referenced than the Z95B, however, and by a large enough gap that we can't put it down to simple panel variance. Still, it's impressively accurate in HDR, and both TVs respond well to calibration if you really want to chase that D65 white point. Both TVs have excellent processing overall. The Z95B's HCX Pro AI processor Mark II does outstanding work on low bitrate streams and sub 4K upscaling, and its HDR10 gradients are very clean, with only mild banding in dark grays and greens. Dolby Vision is the outlier on Panasonic, where banding is more visible in low light scenes, like in these shots of the green night. The G5's Alpha 11 Gen 2 pipeline is also strong for upscaling and artifact cleanup, but after a recent firmware update, its gradient handling in most modes is smooth and accurate. As a heads up for gamers, the G5's launch day HDR10 contouring issue was completely fixed in Game Optimizer mode recently, so there's no need to flip the TV to its Filmmaker mode anymore. The HDR10 gradient issue remains only on the TV's vivid and standard picture modes, but you weren't using those modes, right? Aside from that, there is a shared quirk you should know about. Both sets use a dithering scheme that can produce faint diagonal lines and a light grain-like noise in very dark scenes. On the LG G5, these diagonal lines are very noticeable when you sit very close, which is why some people find it distracting at desk distance, but they're hard to see from a normal couch. On the Panasonic Z95B, the lines are just as noticeable, sometimes even a bit more, along with occasional added grain in noisier dark scenes. At typical seating distances and with a little ambient light, most viewers won't notice it. Firmware has improved gradient banding on the G5, but the basic near black dithering pattern is inherent to how these panels are being driven. As a result, you can't get rid of it by changing just a single setting. For gaming, the G5 is the more flexible screen. You get 4 HDMI 2.1 ports at the full 48 GB per second, 4K at 165 Hz with VRR and PC, and full console compatibility including Dolby Vision gaming on Xbox, plus the usual ALLM and very low input lag. The Z95B tops out at 4K at 144 Hz with VRR, and only 2 of its HDMI inputs carry 48 GB per second bandwidth, so if you run a soundbar without HDMI 2.1 pass-through, you effectively drop to 1 high bandwidth input after eARC. Both have near instantaneous response times and feel snappy in game mode, but if you want to run a 4K 165 Hz PC or juggle multiple high bandwidth sources, the LG makes it easier. Smart platforms are very different on these models. The Z95B runs Fire TV with the familiar app catalog and voice control, and it bakes in Panasonic's 5.1.2 360-degree Soundscape Pro speaker system that projects surprisingly big sound for a TV, including up-firing drivers. It won't replace a soundbar, but it's basically better than any TV sound system out there. The G5 runs WebOS 25 with the newer Magic Remote and fast navigation, but its built-in speakers are more typical for a thin gallery-style set. For audio pass-through, both handle Dolby Atmos and True HD over eARC, but neither supports DTS codecs, which matters if you rely on optical discs. When it comes to inputs, tuners, and formats, this is where practical differences pile up. LG gives you 4 HDMI 2.1 ports at 48 GB per second and sticks with the common ATSC 1.0 tuner. Panasonic equips 2 HDMI 2.1 ports at 48 GB per second, plus 2 HDMI 2.0 ports, and it adds in an ATSC 3.0 tuner for next-gen TV broadcasts. For HDR formats, LG supports HDR10, HLG, and Dolby Vision, while Panasonic supports all of those plus HDR10+. If you want a TV that just works with every HDR disc and stream you throw at it, Panasonic's format coverage is one of the widest of any OLED brand. So, which one should you get? For most buyers, the LG G5 is the safer choice. It's brighter in both HDR and SDR, it's the easiest OLED to build a high-end gaming setup around, and it looks terrific in real-world light. For home theater fans, the Panasonic Z95B makes a very compelling case. The HDR rendering is more strictly faithful by default, it supports every major HDR format, and it includes an ATSC 3.0 tuner, and it sounds better out the box than most TVs. If you want one sentence to take to the store, choose the LG G5 for maximum brightness and gaming flexibility, and choose the Panasonic Z95B for format completeness and a reference-leaning picture that flatters movies. That wraps up our comparison of the Panasonic Z95B and the LG G5 OLED. Are you planning to go all in on the brighter 165Hz G5? Or are you tempted by the Z95B's creator-style HDR and built-in 5.1.2 sound? Let us know in the comments. Until next time, I'm Evan from Ratings.com, helping you find the best products for your needs. Firmware has improved gradient banding on the G5, but the basic near-black dithering pattern is inherent on I was so teased with myself for getting through dithering pattern that I just forgot the rest of the sentence. What do you mean there's more? Okay.